August 10, 1945. The sun hung high over the shattered outskirts of Luminera, a city still smoldering from years of relentless war. Heat rolled off the cracked streets like waves from a furnace, suffocating the air. The Pacific conflict, which had burned across countless islands and jungles for 3 long years, was drawing to a close, but no one dared speak of peace aloud. In the half-ruined district of Briarhold Prison, a convoy of battered trucks rattled to a halt. From their cargo emerged figures that few in the Western ranks had ever expected to see. Women of the Eastern Empire, captured during the final collapses of the scattered garrisons. They stepped down slowly, barefoot, their uniforms nothing more than tattered rags clinging to gaunt, hollowed frames. Some were nurses, conscripted to tend to the wounded with little more than scraps of medicine. Others were clerks, once tasked with maintaining order and records, now abandoned by their superiors. A few were wives of officers, swept along in the chaos of surrender, caught in a war that had long outgrown them. The sight was shocking even to the hardened Western guards. Hair matted with lice, skin mottled with sores, uniforms stiff with weeks of dirt, sweat, and starvation. The women were the living remnants of a collapsing empire. Yet the command came in clipped, precise English, carried through an interpreter. Prepare for inspection. Remove your clothing. A tense silence fell. The women froze, expecting humiliation, punishment, the end of any dignity they still clung to. They had been raised to believe that surrender meant shame, and that the Western forces were merciless, cruel, and vicious toward women of the enemy. But what happened next would shatter all they had been taught. Instead of cruelty, there were crates, wooden boxes packed with fresh cotton dresses, sturdy shoes, undergarments, soap, towels, and clean water. Slowly, confusion spread across the prisoners' faces. The enemy they had been taught to fear, the people whose stories were woven into bedtime lessons of brutality, were offering them something almost unimaginable: care, cleanliness, and dignity. In the northern highlands of Luminera, August of 1945 had left the land littered with the shadows of a dying empire. Eastern troops that once marched confidently across the archipelago now clung to survival, scattered into jungles and ravines, starving and sick. Among these remnants were women who had followed husbands, joined military service, or simply been swept into the maelstrom of war. Their bodies bore the marks of deprivation. Festering sores, emaciation, malaria, and exhaustion etched deep into their faces. Eyes hollow, they moved as though shadows themselves, anticipating the final blow from a world that had long since abandoned them. When the Western Patrol finally cornered them near the crumbling cliffs above the verdant river, both sides held their breath. The soldiers were veterans of Newcrest, Valenwood, and countless jungle campaigns, men who had seen comrades fall to fanatical charges and endured horrors that had stripped away any illusions of mercy. To them, the enemy had always been faceless, a relentless force to be overcome. Yet here, before their rifles, were women so weak they could barely stand, leaning on one another for support, as if the simple act of surrender required courage they no longer possessed. Rumors had circulated among the soldiers, stories of traps, disguises, feigned weakness. Fingers hovered above triggers, but the women raised trembling hands, some dropping to their knees. Weapons, rusty and improvised, were abandoned without a fight. Their surrender was complete, but their fear lingered, deep and palpable. They had been trained to expect horror. What they received instead was the first hint of a world beyond fear. A sergeant unstrapped canteens from his belt and offered water down the line. Hands shaking, lips cracked and dry, the prisoners drank. Some gulped desperately, afraid of poisoning. Others hesitated, incredulous. Medics moved forward, arms loaded with bandages and sulfur powder, tending to festering wounds with calm efficiency. A private broke a cigarette in half and offered it to one woman, who stared as if she were dreaming, before cradling it in her thin fingers like a fragile relic. The soldiers themselves exchanged glances, uncertain. They had fought an enemy who would never yield, only to witness human beings stripped of power and yet treated with respect. The women's indoctrination, years of warnings, of propaganda painting the Western forces as devils, crumbled with each gesture of mercy. One nurse, later recording the moment in a hidden diary, wrote, "The enemy gave us water before they asked our names. I do not understand this world anymore." The trucks moved slowly through the devastated streets, dust rising beneath bare feet mingling with sweat, fear, and the stench of disease. They reached a compound that had once been a schoolyard, now repurposed into a temporary military facility. The women descended, hesitant and trembling, bracing for the degradation they had been told awaited them. Again came the order, "Remove your clothing for inspection." A silence heavier than any battlefield fell. Tears streaked faces as they peeled away tattered rags, exposing emaciated bodies to the scorching sun. Every rib, every wound, every scar bore testimony to months of hardship. Yet the expected humiliation never arrived. Instead, crates were opened. Soap, towels, clean cotton garments, and shoes were distributed. Nurses in crisp uniforms guided the women to makeshift showers, instructing them gently through interpreters. Hesitant at first, the prisoners began to scrub away the dirt, lice, and sweat that had clung to their skin for weeks, until it felt as if they were shedding not only filth but a lifetime of fear. Cotton dresses, plain but clean, were fitted over their renewed bodies. Some clutched the fabric to their faces, inhaling the scent of soap, as though it were the fragrance of another life. The Western guards observed quietly, noting hygienic improvements and emotional responses, unaware that they were witnessing the collapse of a cultural wall of lies that had kept these women prisoners long before the cages and chains ever existed. That evening, they gathered for the first real meal in months. The hall was long and wooden, tables stretching its length, stoves sending trails of smoke across the room. Trays were laid with warm bread, hearty stew thick with meat and vegetables, a small portion of buttered beans, and cups of strong, bitter coffee. The women froze. Months of survival on meager rations, foraging roots and bark, had taught them that food was scarce, sometimes poisoned with despair. Yet here was abundance, distributed not in mockery but with care. Hesitant spoons lifted to lips, tentative at first, then with increasing urgency, as hunger overwhelmed suspicion. Second helpings were offered freely, and whispers spread among them. "The enemy feeds better than our generals. This cannot be true." Even the smallest gestures were transformative. A nurse approached with sugar for coffee, explaining through an interpreter that some preferred sweetness. The prisoner accepted the cup, bowing her head, tears mingling with a bewildered smile. That night, as they lay on cots in the barracks, full for the first time in months, hushed voices speculated if everything they had been taught, of lies, of hatred, of fear, was false. The following morning, examinations began. Barefoot, dressed in clean cotton, the women shuffled across gravel to a converted classroom clinic. Tables lined with jars and antiseptic, medics in white coats and khaki uniforms waiting, the air sharp with the scent of treatment. Anticipation and terror gripped them. Whispers of experimentation and humiliation had followed them since their capture. Yet, as the medics worked, nothing cruel occurred. Wounds were cleaned and dressed gently, scurvy treated with vitamins, lice removed with careful hands. A woman with violent coughing was placed beneath an oxygen mask, the cool air easing the fire in her lungs. Another suffering from malaria received quinine, her fever breaking within days. Every action was measured, patient, humane. The women's astonishment grew. They had been raised to expect brutality, but here, mercy, professionalism, and empathy reigned. Nurses held hands during injections, doctors double-checked dressings, and even the smallest kindness shattered expectations built over years of indoctrination. Over the next days, the compound became a place of subtle transformation. Meals, clothing, and medical care gradually replaced fear with incredulity, suspicion with awe. Journals discovered later revealed a recurring thought: the enemy is human. They are not the monsters we were taught to fear. The Western soldiers themselves were touched by the quiet dignity of the prisoners. Years of war had taught them that compassion was often a liability. Yet here it became a quiet weapon, dismantling prejudice and propaganda more effectively than any battle. As the women regained health, their voices returned. They whispered, shared memories, and even began to laugh softly, though it sounded strange and fragile at first. For those who had only known fear, hunger, and deprivation, this was a rebirth of sorts. The empire they had believed eternal had abandoned them. The people they had been told to hate had restored their humanity. Weeks passed, and the women were integrated into the compound's daily routine. Labor was light, meals abundant, and medical supervision constant. Their diaries chronicled astonishment at the meticulous care they received. Clean water every day, clothing replaced as needed, medical attention given not grudgingly but with respect. One nurse, once a fervent believer in the Eastern Empire's doctrine, reflected, "Every word I learned to hate is a lie. Everything I feared is kindness. I do not understand this world, but I feel alive again." By the end of August, the war formally ended, but for these women, it had ended earlier, in a small courtyard under the scorching sun, with crates of clothing, bars of soap, and the simple mercy of strangers. The acts were small, almost mundane in military reports, but monumental in consequence. Fear had been replaced by bewilderment, indoctrination by realization, and hate by respect. Their return to health and dignity did not erase the trauma of years of conflict, but it planted a seed that humanity could survive even the harshest propaganda, and that compassion could triumph where bullets and bombs often failed. The Western forces had not only captured bodies that day, they had captured hearts, shattered illusions, and unknowingly rewritten the moral code of those who had been taught only obedience, loyalty, and fear. The mountains, rivers, and burned-out towns of Luminera would continue to whisper stories of the dying empire. Yet within the walls of the compound, another story quietly unfolded. That mercy, even in war, could speak louder than the roar of guns. The women, once prisoners, now survivors, carried with them the memory of something unexpected. That in the world's darkest hours, humanity could still shine, simple and undeniable. And so, August 10th, 1945, became a day not of conquest, nor of surrender, but of revelation. A day when kindness shattered indoctrination, and mercy proved more powerful than fear.